All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're diving into part one of a two-part series looking at a seriously groundbreaking, science-grounded approach to early recovery. We're unpacking Carrie Lockhart's handbook, Finding the Signal. Now, we're going to cover the foundational stuff today, right up through Chapter 5. And listen, if you or maybe someone you love has ever felt just totally lost in the woods of addiction, this is absolutely for you. We're not doing vague platitudes today? No way. We are looking at hard neuroscience, the gritty reality of rebuilding a life, and a completely alternative framework for actually understanding recovery.
So here's the thought. What if the language of recovery is exactly the thing keeping you from it? You know, there's this unspoken barrier that keeps so many folks isolated in their addiction. Traditional recovery often leans heavily on religious language, the traditional God talk. And for a lot of people, that language just doesn't land. Maybe it was weaponized against them in the past, or maybe it just doesn't fit how they see the world. And the real tragedy is feeling like you have to stay stuck, isolated, just because you can't bring yourself to walk through that specific door. But, as we'll see, you absolutely don't have to stay isolated. There is, in fact, another way in.
Which brings us to Section 1, the alternative recovery door.
Okay, let's dive into this. So, the author actually wrote two books that do two very different jobs. The first one, Quantum Soul, well, that's the heavy theoretical architecture. We're talking a 400-page deep dive into quantum physics, consciousness research, field theory, the whole shebang. But Finding the Signal, that's the practical handbook. It's the what happens after you walk through the door guide. And here's the best part. You do not need to read the massive theory book to use this practical one today. Look, traditional religious framing has saved literally millions of lives, but it does require accepting a very specific theological view. This quantum and science bridge, it provides a brand new door into that exact same room. It uses established neuroscience, clinical psychology, and principles of quantum physics to explain what's actually happening in your brain and your spirit during recovery. It doesn't ask you to adopt a new religion, it only asks for your willingness to connect to something larger than your own isolated self.
Moving right along to Section 2, Biology, Trauma, and Pain.
Right off the bat, we've got to dismantle a really destructive myth. The idea that addiction is some sort of moral failing. Let me be clear, it is not a weakness. It's not a character flaw. Yet so many people look at the wreckage of their lives, the burned bridges, the repeated relapses, and they ask themselves in the dead of night, what is fundamentally wrong with me? Was I just born bad? It's an agonizing question.
Wrong question. Actually, scratch that. It's the completely wrong framework. I want to say this with absolute, firm authority. Asking what is wrong with me assumes a fundamental moral defect. It assumes you chose your way into this mess through sheer weakness. And guys, that is neurologically and factually false. Let's look at what's actually happening under the hood.
And this brilliantly illustrates the actual mechanics of addiction. First off, your reward system gets hijacked. Substances trigger dopamine at levels like 5 to 10 times higher than any natural experience. The brain, which is just doing exactly what it evolved to do to keep you alive, records this as critically important for survival. Over time, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse backs this up, this physically alters your prefrontal cortex. That's the center for judgment and impulse control. Your brain is literally structurally reorganized around the substance. Just let that sink in for a second. Now add to that the fact that 40 to 60% of your vulnerability to addiction is genetically inherited. It's in your DNA. And finally, the CDC's ACE study, that's Adverse Childhood Experiences, proves that early trauma chronically floods a developing brain with cortisol, physically rewiring the nervous system for threat and anxiety. So to sum it up, addiction is a physical reorganization. It is not a weakness.
This quote from Dr. Gabor Mate just hits the nail on the head. The question is never why the addiction, but always why the pain. It perfectly summarizes the reality here. Most addiction, it doesn't begin with the substance. It begins with a hole, a persistent disconnection from safety or meaning, a nervous system that's already wired for anxiety. The addiction is simply a crude and yet ultimately destructive solution trying to fill that pre-existing hole of trauma. The addict isn't broken. The addict is isolated and misfueling.
All right, let's transition to Section 3, the burning and the bottom.
So, once that crude solution really takes hold, we enter what the book calls the burning. The arc of addiction follows a deeply predictable pattern, almost like a script. It starts with relief, moves into a total reorganization of your priorities, and ends in compulsion and severe consequences. I really want to remind you here, if you're in this, you are not uniquely damaged. The destruction happens gradually. Finances dry up, trust erodes, health takes a hit. But listen, the idea that you have to hit some fixed rock bottom before you can change, that is a dangerous myth. The bottom is simply wherever you finally decide to stop digging. And as you look at all that wreckage, it's absolutely crucial to understand Dr. Brené Brown's distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt can actually motivate change, right? It allows for an honest look at what happened so you can finally put it down. Shame, on the other hand, is toxic. Shame drives concealment, it drives isolation, and inevitably it drives a return to the exact same substance that's destroying you. The burning was just a chapter in your story. It's for sure not your identity.
Which leads us to Section 4, Steps 1 through 3.
Let's move to and see how this builds. How do we actually walk out of the burning? Well, the first 3 steps of traditional 12-step programs are the door. But instead of using theological language, we're mapping these first 3 steps directly onto neuroscience and quantum principles. Step 1 is admitting powerlessness. In neuroscience terms, this means your system is in decoherence. Essentially, it's a state of profound internal chaos where willpower literally cannot override the drive to use. Your prefrontal cortex is so structurally altered that you need an entirely different tool. Then, step 2 asks you to come to believe. Think of this like quantum entanglement. It's the process of opening a connection and recognizing that your individual, isolated consciousness, it isn't the ceiling of available resources. Something much larger is accessible to you. Finally, step 3 is the decision. In quantum mechanics, there's this thing called the observer effect, where observing a system resolves it into a definite outcome. Psychologically, this step is the surrender of your ego's rigidity. It's letting go of the need to control everything out of fear and allowing a larger connection to help determine the outcomes. And the kicker here? Belief in this context only requires a willingness to connect, not absolute certainty, just willingness.
Next up, Section 5, the 4th step bomb. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it breaks down the action. You absolutely cannot skip those first 3 steps, but once they're locked in, you hit what the book calls the 4th step bomb. This step asks for a searching and fearless moral inventory. Now hear me, it's not a punishment, it's an audit. It's a powerful detonation of false structures. Put in quantum terms, your unexamined thoughts are out there generating chaotic interference. To collapse those chaotic patterns into visible, changeable realities, you actually have to observe them. So practically speaking, you grab a physical notebook and work across 3 specific categories. First up, resentments. You list who you're angry at, what happened, and crucially, your part in it. Was it fear, selfishness, or pride operating underneath? Look, you can't change other people, but you can absolutely change your own patterns. Second, fears. Unexamined trauma literally lives in the physical body. It drives present behavior as if those old threats are still right in front of you. Writing them down begins to loosen that physical grip. Third is conduct. This is naming who you harmed and how. You're taking honest responsibility here, but without drowning in that toxic shame we talked about earlier. When you do this whole inventory, it's like a giant puzzle coming together. You'll see the exact same 2 or 3 character defects running across your entire life, and seeing the machinery is exactly what allows you to finally change it. Let's pivot to Section 6, the reality of rebuilding.
That brings us to Chapter 5, and it sheds a harsh, bright light on a truth almost nobody warns you about. When you finally stop using the fog lifts, right? But you're immediately confronted with the massive wreckage left behind, and you're trying to deal with it while operating a brain that is still deeply fragile. Getting sober and actually rebuilding a life, those are 2 completely different challenges. Look at this brain healing timeline from NIDA. On day 1, reality hits you like a freight train, but it takes 6 full months for your prefrontal cortex, again, the area for emotional regulation, planning, impulse control, to even begin substantial recovery. 6 months. And it takes up to 2 whole years for the continued restoration of your cognitive function. You are essentially trying to rebuild a demolished house using a brain that is still in the shop. This visually demonstrates exactly why group support isn't just a nice to have, it's not optional. Your cognitive capacity is only slowly coming back online, and you need the people around you to carry some of that heavy load you just cannot carry alone right now. Because wow, the load of early recovery is heavy. Let's look at the practical reality here. Financially, stopping the substance doesn't magically reset your bank account, unfortunately. It just gives you the clarity to finally look at the debt without avoiding it. Legally, if you've got outstanding issues, you have to remember that courts respond to engagement, not disappearance. Ghosting the system doesn't work. And relationally, the people you love absorb the massive impact of your addiction. Repairing that trust takes time, and you cannot control their healing timeline. Showing up with honest consistency is literally the only argument that works. So the crucial point is this. When the financial, the legal, and the relational stress all hit you at the exact same time, it is incredibly tempting to treat your spiritual maintenance, your meetings, your prayer, your quiet connection, whatever that looks like for you, as a luxury. Something you can just cut until things calm down. Do not do it.
Cutting your spiritual practice when life gets hard is exactly the mechanism that drives the relapse loop. It's like stopping physical therapy right when your injury hurts the absolute most. That maintenance is the only thing making it possible to function while life is still messy and hard. The signal is there. The real question is, will you commit the time to keep it tuned in? We've covered the brutal realities of early rebuilding today, but how do you actually maintain that signal long-term when life inevitably throws a curveball? Well, you'll have to join us for part 2 as we dive into the second half of finding the signal to answer exactly that. See you then.